My name is Patricia, and today I invite you into the quietest, most broken parts of my soul. They say that the people we love the most have the power to destroy us, but we often forget that our own hearts, blinded by fear, can be the most dangerous weapons of all. Before we begin this journey through a storm of silence and a circle of gold, I want to say a sincere thank you. Thank you for choosing to spend your precious time here with me. It is a profound honor to have you as a witness to my story. Welcome to Queen's Revenge. If this story touches a chord within you, if it speaks to a pain you've felt or a love you cherish, I humbly invite you to subscribe and join our family. May this story remind you that even when the world goes dark and the shadows feel too long, there is always a light waiting to be found. Never let your doubts win. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't in moving on, but in finding the courage to stay and see the truth. This is my story. This is how I almost lost my sanctuary and how I found my way home. They say that love is a storm, a wild and tempestuous force that uproots trees and reshapes coastlines. But for me, love was never a gale. It was the quiet, steady rhythm of the tide, a predictable, comforting pulse that guided my days and anchored my nights. My life with David was built not on the grand gestures that Hollywood favors, but on the infinitesimal details of a shared existence. It was in the way the floorboards groaned under his weight in a specific, melodic sequence every morning at 6 o'clock. It was the scent of cedarwood and old parchment that clung to his coats. To the world, he was a man of industry, a man of quiet focus and tireless work. To me, he was my sanctuary, the only place in this vast, chaotic universe where I could finally stop holding my breath. In the early years of our marriage, I used to wonder if such peace was a precursor to boredom. I was young then, foolishly believing that passion required friction. But as the years turned into a decade, I realized that the greatest luxury a human being can possess is the feeling of being truly known. David knew the geography of my silences. He knew that when I stared out the kitchen window for too long, I was thinking of my mother. He knew that I took my coffee with a scandalous amount of cream, but only on rainy Tuesday mornings. He was the keeper of my history, the silent witness to my evolution, and the steady hand that caught me every time I stumbled over the uneven terrain of my own anxieties. I remember watching him across a crowded room during a friend's anniversary party last month. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the clinking of champagne flutes, a cacophony of social performance. David was standing near the balcony, listening intently to an elderly man recount a story he had likely told 100 times before. David didn't look bored. He didn't look for an escape. He stood there with his head tilted slightly, a posture of genuine reverence. And then, as if sensing my gaze through the crowd, he turned. Our eyes met, and in that split second, the noise of the party vanished. There was a softness in his expression, a secret smile meant only for me, that whispered, "I am here, and you are here, and that is all that matters." It was a look that anchored me, reminding me that no matter how loud the world became, we had a language of our own. His hands were the most honest part of him. They were the hands of a man who did not shy away from the world's grit. The palms were lined with the history of his labor, the skin calloused and rough, etched with the scars of building a life from the ground up. I loved those hands. I loved the way they felt against my cheek, the contrast of his rugged skin against my own, a reminder of the strength that shielded me. When he held my hand, he didn't just grip it, he enveloped it, as if protecting something fragile. Those calluses were a testament to his devotion, a physical manifestation of the hours he spent ensuring our home remained a fortress of comfort. I would often trace the lines of his palms while we sat on the porch in the evenings, reading the story of his hard work like Betrayal, feeling a profound sense of gratitude that this man, with all his strength and iron will, chose to be gentle with me. The morning of the day everything changed began like any other. The sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains of our bedroom, casting long, golden fingers across the duvet. David was already gone, leaving behind only the ghost of his warmth on the pillow and the faint aroma of roasted coffee lingering in the hallway. I went about my chores with a light heart, humming a tune that had been stuck in my head since breakfast. It was one of those rare days where the air felt charged with a strange, beautiful clarity. I looked around our home, the bookshelf we had assembled together, the mismatched ceramic mugs, the framed photographs of us laughing in the rain, and I felt an overwhelming surge of affection. It was a sudden, impulsive decision. I wanted to see him, not because I had news to share or a problem to solve, but simply because the weight of my love for him felt too heavy to carry alone in an empty house. I wanted to see the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled at me unexpectedly. I wanted to bring a piece of our sanctuary into the sterile, gray environment of his office. I decided to prepare his favorite meal, a rich, slow-cooked beef stew that filled the kitchen with a scent of thyme, rosemary, and home. I spent the afternoon meticulously chopping vegetables, searing the meat until it was perfectly browned, and letting the flavors marry in a symphony of comfort. As I packed the meal into a thermal container, I felt like a young girl on her first date. There was a flutter in my chest, a giddy anticipation that felt almost sacred. I wrapped the container in a linen cloth and tucked a small, handwritten note inside the bag. I couldn't wait until dinner to tell you how much I love you. I checked my reflection in the hallway mirror, smoothing down my hair and adjusting my coat. I looked like a woman who was cherished, a woman whose heart was full. I felt invincible, shielded by the certainty of our bond. The walk to his workplace was brisk. The autumn wind nipped at my ears, but I didn't mind. I held the warm bag close to my chest, the heat from the stew seeping through the fabric and warming my hands. I watched the people passing by, the hurried commuters, the tired shoppers, the teenagers lost in their phones, and I felt a pang of pity for them. Did they have what I had? Did they have an anchor? Did they have a sanctuary to return to? I felt like I was carrying a secret treasure, a golden thread that connected me to the most wonderful man I had ever known. David's office was located in a sturdy, brick building on the edge of the downtown district. It was a place of blueprints, heavy machinery, and the constant hum of productivity. I had been there many times before, usually for formal events or planned lunches, but this surprise felt different. It felt intimate. It was an offering of myself, a bridge built across the divide of our separate workdays. As I approached the heavy glass doors of the entrance, I took a deep breath, savoring the cool air before entering the warmth of the building. I walked through the lobby, nodding to the receptionist who recognized me with a polite smile. My footsteps echoed on the polished floor, a confident, rhythmic sound that matched the beating of my heart. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, my fingers tightening around the handles of the bag. I imagined his face, the surprise, the initial confusion turning into that warm, melting grin that always made me feel like the most beautiful woman in the room. I imagined him clearing off his desk, pushing aside the stacks of paper to make room for the meal I had made with such care. I reached the corridor that led to his private office. The lights were slightly dimmed, and the usual bustle of the afternoon seemed to have settled into a quiet lull. I walked softly, wanting to maintain the element of surprise until the very last moment. My heart was full of warmth, my mind filled with images of our future, the anniversaries yet to come, the quiet mornings in bed, the gray hair we would eventually share. I was Patricia, and I was the luckiest woman alive. I was seconds away from seeing my sanctuary, my husband, my David. I reached for the handle of his door, the metal cool against my palm, a small smile playing on my lips. I was home, or so I thought. The transition from the vibrant, windswept street to the interior of David's office building should have been a simple step across a threshold, but in hindsight, it felt like crossing into a different dimension. Outside, the world was still humming with the casual indifference of a Tuesday afternoon. The sun was a pale gold coin tossed into a porcelain sky, and I was still that woman from Chapter 1, the one whose heart was an overfilled cup, spilling over with a simple, domestic joy of a beef stew and a handwritten note. I remember the exact moment the light-hearted hum in my chest faltered. It wasn't a sudden stop. It was a slow, mechanical grinding, like a clock whose gears had finally surrendered to the dust. The lobby of the firm was a cathedral of glass and polished granite, a place where the air always felt a few degrees cooler than the rest of the world. Usually, I found the clinical precision of the architecture impressive, a reflection of David's orderly mind. But today, as I walked toward the elevators, the silence of the building began to feel heavy. It was a jarring, artificial quiet that seemed to swallow the sound of my footsteps. I clutched the thermal bag closer. The warmth of the stew was still there, pulsing against my ribs like a phantom heartbeat, but my own pulse had begun to quicken with a strange, unbidden anxiety. I reached the second floor. The corridor was long and lined with heavy oak doors, most of them closed to keep in the secrets of industry. David's office was at the very end, a corner suite with a large glass partition that looked out into the communal workspace. He liked the transparency of it. He always said a leader should be visible to his people. As I approached, I slowed my pace. I wanted to catch a glimpse of him before he saw me, to see the version of the man I loved, the version that commanded respect and moved with such quiet authority. I reached the glass, but I didn't knock. My hand froze midair, inches from the transparent barrier, as the scene inside unfolded like a silent film that I wasn't meant to watch. David wasn't at his desk. He was standing by the window, silhouetted against the bright afternoon light. And he wasn't alone. Standing so close to him that the space between them seemed non-existent was a girl. I call her a girl because that is how she registered in my mind, a creature of soft edges and unlined skin, a personification of a springtime I could no longer claim. She couldn't have been more than 24. Her hair was a waterfall of chestnut silk that caught the light, and her face, even from this distance, glowed with a luminous, effortless youth. She was laughing, a silent vibration of her shoulders, and her eyes were fixed on David with an intensity that made the air in the hallway feel thin. But it was David's posture that broke me. He was leaning in toward her, his body inclined in a way that suggested a shared secret, a private orbit. His hand, the calloused, honest hand I had traced only last night, was hovering near her, gesturing with a familiarity that felt like a physical blow to my stomach. He wasn't the leader in this moment. He was a man enchanted. The sanctuary I had described so proudly to myself only an hour ago felt like it was being dismantled brick by brick, right there in front of me, through a sheet of glass that offered no protection. I watched, paralyzed, as he reached out and touched her arm. It was a brief contact, but in the vacuum of my shock, it felt like an eternity. I saw her look down, her cheeks flushing a delicate pink, and then she looked back up at him with a smile so radiant it felt like a mockery of my own aging face. In that instant, I felt the weight of every year I had lived, every gray hair I had carefully hidden, every wrinkle that spoke of our decade together. I felt like a relic, a faded photograph being replaced by a high-definition masterpiece. The thermal bag, once a vessel of warmth and devotion, suddenly felt like it was filled with lead. The weight of it pulled at my shoulder, dragging me down toward the cold granite floor. The scent of the rosemary and thyme, which had seemed so inviting in my kitchen, now felt sickly and suffocating. I thought of the note tucked inside. I couldn't wait until dinner to tell you how much I love you, and I felt a wave of humiliation, so intense it made my ears ring. How pathetic I must look, standing in a hallway with a lunchbox like a dutiful servant, while he found a new sun to orbit. A sudden, sharp movement inside the office snapped me out of my trance. David turned slightly, his gaze moving toward the door. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my grief. I couldn't let him see me. I couldn't bear the look of guilt, or worse, the look of pity, that would surely cross his face if he caught me witnessing his betrayal. I didn't want to hear an explanation that I knew would be a lie. I didn't want to see the sanctuary burn to the ground while I stood there holding the matches. I turned on my heel and began to walk. No, I didn't walk, I fled. My footsteps, which had been so rhythmic and confident on the way in, were now a frantic, stumbling mess. I didn't take the elevator. I couldn't risk the wait, the possibility of the doors opening to reveal him standing there with her. I pushed through the heavy fire door to the stairwell, the sound of the metal clanging shut echoing through the hollow space like a gunshot. As I descended the stairs, my vision began to blur. The tears didn't fall at first. They just pooled in my eyes, turning the world into a smeared, impressionistic nightmare of gray and white. I hit the ground floor and burst through the lobby, ignoring the curious look from the receptionist. I needed air. I needed to be away from the glass and the granite and the suffocating silence of his professional life. I stepped back out onto the street, but the world had changed. The sun was still there, but it felt cold, a distant and unfeeling star. The wind was no longer a playful nip. It was a biting, cruel reminder of my own isolation. I walked blindly, my feet taking me toward home out of sheer muscle memory, while my mind replayed the scene over and over again. The way he leaned in, the way she laughed, the touch. I looked down at the bag in my hand. It was still warm. The stew was still there, a testament to a love that, until 10 minutes ago, I believed was indestructible. I saw a trash bin at the corner of the block. Without a second thought, I swung the bag and dropped it inside. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. The beef, the vegetables, the hours of labor, and the handwritten note, all of it discarded amongst the city's refuse. It was a funeral for an intention. I stood there for a moment, my hands trembling in the empty air. I felt hollowed out, as if someone had reached inside me and scooped out the very core of my being. The anchor was gone. The sanctuary was a ruin. As I finally let the first tear slide down my cheek, I realized that the worst kind of silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the sudden, jarring realization that the person you thought was listening has been tuned into a different frequency all along. I began the long walk home, a stranger in my own life, carrying nothing but the weight of a secret I never wanted to know. The front door groaned as I stepped inside, but it wasn't the welcoming sound of a sanctuary anymore. It was the sound of a lid closing on a coffin. I stood in the foyer, my hands empty, my heart emptier. The house, which only hours ago had been a canvas of our shared dreams and quiet comforts, now felt like a hollow shell, a museum dedicated to a life that had been a lie. The air was stagnant, heavy with the lingering scent of the rosemary and thyme I had used for the stew, a ghost of a meal that was now rotting in a city trash bin. I walked into the kitchen, and the sight of the clean countertops felt like a mockery. This was where I had stood, glowing with a wife's simple devotion, unaware that the world was about to tilt on its axis. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat at the wooden dining table, the same table where we had planned our vacations, discussed our finances, and whispered our secrets. In the dim, gray twilight filtering through the windows, the furniture took on strange, distorted shapes. The armchair in the corner looked like a crouching beast. The shadows on the wall seemed to stretch and reach for me like skeletal fingers. I sat in the darkness, a ghost haunting my own home. I was waiting. I was waiting for the man I thought I knew to return, so I could look into his eyes and see if I could find the stranger I had witnessed through that glass partition. Time became a fluid, agonizing thing. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway felt like a needle pricking my skin. Tick. He is laughing with her. Tick. He is holding her hand. Tick. He is forgetting 10 years of us for a moment of her. I wondered if he was thinking of me at all. Did he feel the phantom weight of my ring on his finger? Or was he so intoxicated by that youthful glow that the memory of his wife had been pushed into the dusty corners of his mind? The silence of the house was absolute, yet inside my head, there was a deafening roar of questions that had no answers. Then I heard it, the distant, familiar crunch of gravel in the driveway. Usually, that sound brought a surge of relief to my chest, the signal that my world was whole again. Today, it felt like the approach of an executioner. I didn't move. I stayed seated in the shadows, my spine rigid, my breathing shallow. I heard the car door slam, the rhythmic jingle of his keys, and then, the most jarring sound of all, a whistle. He was whistling. A light, airy tune, something popular on the radio, something that suggested a heart without a single care in the world. The sound grated against my raw nerves like a serrated blade. How could he whistle? How could the air in his lungs be so free when mine felt like it was thick with ash? The front door swung open, and the house was suddenly flooded with the mundane noise of his arrival. The rustle of his coat, the thud of his briefcase, the heavy, confident stride of a man who believed his secrets were safe behind a wall of domestic routine. "Patricia? Honey, why is it so dark in here?" his voice called out, warm and resonant. It was the same voice that had whispered, "I love you," into the crook of my neck this morning. Now, it sounded like a foreign language I no longer understood. He walked into the kitchen and flicked the light switch. The sudden brightness was violent. I winced, my eyes stinging, but I didn't look away from the table. I could feel him standing there, confused by my stillness, by the lack of a greeting, by the heavy atmosphere that I had wrapped around myself like a shroud. "There you are," he said, moving toward me with a playful grin. "I thought you might have fallen asleep. You wouldn't believe the day I've had. So much running around. I'm starving. Did I smell something good cooking earlier?" He reached out, his hand descending toward my shoulder, intending to pull me into the familiar curve of his embrace. As his fingers touched the fabric of my sweater, I felt a physical jolt of electricity, not the spark of passion, but the sharp, defensive shock of a wounded animal. I didn't scream. I didn't pull away with a flourish. I simply became a statue of ice. I went cold, my muscles locking, my skin turning into a porcelain barrier that refused to let him in. His hand faltered. The grin on his face wavered, then slowly dissolved into an expression of bewildered concern. "Patricia? What is it? Are you feeling okay?" I slowly lifted my head to look at him. I wanted to see the guilt. I wanted to see the tremor in his hands or the shiftiness in his gaze. But David was a master of his own narrative. He looked at me with nothing but clear-eyed worry, his brow furrowed in that way that usually made me want to smooth over his troubles. For a moment, a sliver of doubt pierced my heart. Did I see what I thought I saw? But then the image of his hand on that girl's arm flashed in my mind like a brand, searing away the uncertainty. "I'm fine," I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. It was thin, brittle, and devoid of any color. It was the voice of a woman who was speaking from the bottom of a very deep well. "You don't look fine. You look pale. And why is the stove cold?" I could have sworn I smelled stew when I drove up. He tried to chuckle, a hollow sound that died in the space between us. He tried again to bridge the gap, stepping closer, reaching for my face this time. "Talk to me, Trish. What happened today?" I stood up abruptly, the legs of the chair screeching against the floor, a harsh, dissonant cry that filled the kitchen. I didn't let him touch me. The pain was so immense, so gargantuan, that it had moved past the point of tears or tantrums. When you are truly broken, there is no noise. The scream stays trapped in the throat because the soul knows that no sound could ever be loud enough to express the agony. I felt like a glass vessel that had been shattered but was still somehow holding its shape, terrified that a single word or a single touch would cause me to collapse into a heap of jagged shards. "I'm just tired, David," I whispered, the lie tasting like copper in my mouth. "Just incredibly tired." I began to walk past him, heading toward the stairs. I could feel his gaze on my back, a heavy, confused weight. I knew he was standing there in the middle of our bright, modern kitchen, wondering why the air had suddenly turned arctic. Part of me wanted to turn around and shriek the truth at him. I wanted to demand to know who she was, why she was laughing, and what he had done with the money under the sofa. But the wall of silence was my only protection. If I spoke, I would have to acknowledge that my life was over. If I stayed silent, I could pretend, if only for a few more hours, that I was still the woman who lived in a sanctuary. I retreated to our bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. A few minutes later, I heard him come up the stairs. He moved quietly now, his earlier cheerfulness extinguished. He entered the room and watched me from the doorway, a shadow in the periphery of my vision. I didn't turn. I watched him through the lens of my broken trust, a distorted, fractured perspective where every movement he made seemed suspicious, every sigh a calculated performance. He was my husband. He was my anchor. But as I sat there in the gathering dark, I realized that the man standing in the doorway was a stranger inhabiting the body of someone I once loved. And the silence between us wasn't just a lack of words, it was the sound of a foundation crumbling, one grain of sand at a time. The night did not bring the mercy of sleep. Instead, it offered a hollow, obsidian silence that felt like it was pressing against the walls of our bedroom, trying to crush the very air out of my lungs. I sat on the edge of the mattress, my back turned to the door, staring at the silver moonlight as it cut a jagged path across the floorboards. In the quiet, my mind was a treacherous thing, a projector stuck on a loop, playing and replaying those few seconds outside David's office. I saw the girl's laughter again, bright, effortless, and cruel in its vitality. I saw the way the sunlight had caught the sheen of her hair, a sharp contrast to the dullness I felt in my own soul. I was drowning in bitter contemplation, wondering at what exact point the man who was my anchor had decided to cut the rope and let me drift into the dark. I heard him move behind me. The bed creaked, a familiar sound that usually signaled the end of the day's worries, but now it sounded like a warning. I didn't turn. I couldn't. I was afraid that if I looked at him, I would see the lie etched into the lines of his face. I felt him stand up and walk toward the dresser. There was a faint rustle of fabric, the metallic click of a drawer opening, and then the sound of his footsteps returning toward me. He didn't stop at the edge of the bed. He stepped into my line of sight, his shadow falling over me like a shroud. I looked up, expecting, I don't know what, an apology? A confession? A cold look of indifference? But what I saw was far more unsettling. David was looking down at me with a soft, cryptic smile, the kind of smile a person wears when they are holding a secret they think is beautiful. In his hands, he held a yellow tailor's measuring tape. It dangled from his fingers like a limp, plastic snake. The sight of it was so mundane, yet in the context of my shattered heart, it felt utterly bizarre, almost grotesque. "Patricia," he whispered, his voice low and vibrating with a strange sort of excitement. "Stay still for just a second. I need to check something." I froze, not out of obedience, but out of a paralyzed sort of confusion. Before I could find the words to ask him what he was doing, he stepped behind me. I felt his breath on the nape of my neck, that warm, familiar heat that used to send a shiver of comfort down my spine. Now it made my skin crawl. I felt the cold, slick texture of the measuring tape as he brought it forward, wrapping it gently, meticulously around my throat. The sensation was terrifying. The tape was light, but to me, it felt like a noose. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic, rhythmic thud that I was certain he could hear. I stared straight ahead at our reflection in the vanity mirror across the room. In the dim light, he looked like a shadow man, carefully measuring the circumference of my neck while I sat there, a silent victim of his inexplicable whim. My mind raced through a gallery of horrors. Why was he doing this? Was he comparing me to her? Had he looked at that girl's slender, youthful neck and decided he needed to see how far I had fallen from that standard of perfection? Was he measuring me for some final, cruel joke? The intimacy of the gesture, the way his fingers brushed against my skin to ensure the tape was snug, felt like a sacrilege. It was a parody of the way he used to touch me, a clinical assessment where there used to be adoration. Just as I thought, he murmured to himself, his voice laced with a satisfaction that turned my blood to ice. He tightened the tape just a fraction of an inch, his eyes focused on the numbers, with a chilling intensity. In that moment, the pain that had been a dull ache since the afternoon erupted into a searing, white-hot resentment. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a desperate need to reclaim my own body from his touch. I wasn't just a set of measurements. I wasn't a project to be analyzed or a relic to be compared to a newer model. "Don't," I snapped, the word tearing itself from my throat. I recoiled, twisting away from him with a violence that caught him off guard. I pushed his hands away, the hands that had built our home, the hands that had held me through grief, the hands I had seen touching another woman only hours before. When my palms met his skin, it didn't feel like the homecoming it once was. It felt like a sting, a sharp and jarring contact that left my hands trembling. The measuring tape fell from his grasp, coiling on the carpet, like a discarded ribbon. David stumbled back a step, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and hurt. The cryptic smile was gone, replaced by a look of profound bewilderment. Trish, I was just... What were you doing, David? I demanded, my voice trembling with the weight of everything I was holding back. I wanted to scream about the office. I wanted to scream about the money. I wanted to scream about the girl. But the words were caught in a logjam of agony. You come home whistling while I'm falling apart, and then you try to measure me? Like I'm a piece of lumber? Like I'm something you're trying to fit into a box. It's not like that, he said, reaching out again, his voice pleading. You're taking this all wrong. I just wanted to be sure. Sure of what? How much I've changed. How much older I look than the people you spend your time with now. My voice rose, cracking under the strain. I stood up, putting the bed between us, creating a physical barrier to match the emotional one that had frozen solid in my chest. Get away from me. Just go away. He stood there for a long moment, the measuring tape lying between us on the floor, a yellow line drawn in the sand of our marriage. He looked like he wanted to say something, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for a language we both still spoke. But I was done listening to the silence. I was done trying to decipher the codes of a man who could touch a stranger with such ease and then come home to measure his wife's throat in the dark. I'm sorry, he finally whispered, though I couldn't tell what he was apologizing for. The measurement, the secrecy, or the fact that he had been caught in a life that no longer had room for me. He turned and walked toward the door, his shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. He looked defeated, but I felt no victory. As the door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone in the silver moonlight, I collapsed back onto the bed. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to rub away the sensation of the tape against my skin. The touch that used to be my only medicine had become a poison, and the man who was my sanctuary had become the very thing I needed to be protected from. I stared at the measuring tape on the floor. It looked so small, so insignificant. Yet it had measured the exact distance between us, a gap that now felt as wide and as cold as the ocean. I realized then that the most painful thing isn't being unloved. It's being measured and found wanting by the only person who was ever supposed to see you as enough. The morning arrived not with the promise of a new beginning, but with the cold, gray persistence of a fever that refused to break. I hadn't slept. I had merely existed in a state of suspended animation, watching the shadows shift across the ceiling until they were bleached away by a sun that felt intrusive and unwelcome. Every muscle in my body ached with the tension of the previous night, the phantom sensation of that measuring tape still stinging my skin like a brand of ownership I no longer recognized. Suspicion, once a flickering spark in the back of my mind, had transformed into a potent, slow-acting poison coursing through my veins. It altered the way I breathed, the way I moved, and the way I perceived the very air in our home. Everything was tainted. Every familiar object, the floral vase, the crooked picture frame, the worn rug, now felt like a prop in a play I hadn't realized I was starring in. I stayed in bed, feigning the heavy, rhythmic breathing of sleep as I heard David move about the room. I felt the mattress shift as he stood, heard the soft rustle of him dressing, and the muffled click of his watch being buckled onto his wrist. Usually, these were the sounds of comfort, the morning liturgy of a life well lived. Today, they were the sounds of a stranger preparing his armor. I waited until I heard his footsteps recede down the stairs, the familiar groan of the fifth step acting as a signal that he was safely out of sight. Only then did I rise, my movements fluid and silent, driven by a desperate, wretched need to know the depth of the hole I was falling into. I crept to the landing, pressing my back against the cold wallpaper of the hallway. I stood in the shadows, a specter in my own house, peering through the gap in the banister. Below me, the living room was bathed in the pale, dusty light of early morning. David was there, but he wasn't heading for the door to leave for work. He wasn't reaching for his briefcase or checking his phone. Instead, he was standing in the center of the room, looking around with a furtive, cautious intensity that made my heart recoil. He looked like a thief in his own sanctuary. Then he did something that felt like a physical blow to my chest. He knelt. It was a slow, deliberate movement, the kind of gesture one might use for prayer or to comfort a child. But there was no sanctity in this act. He knelt by the side of our old leather sofa, the one we had saved for months to buy, the one where we had spent countless rainy Sunday afternoons tangled together in a world of our own making. He reached underneath, his arm disappearing into a hidden crevice between the frame and the floorboards. I held my breath, the silence in the hallway so absolute that I could hear the frantic drumming of my own blood in my ears. After a moment of searching, his hand emerged. He was holding a thick, manila envelope. Even from my vantage point in the shadows, I could see the way it bulged, the unmistakable weight of paper stacked upon paper. He opened it, and for a fleeting second, the pale light caught the flash of green cash. A substantial, jarring amount of money. My mind began to scream, a cacophony of voices each vying to name the betrayal. Where had this come from? We shared everything. Our bank accounts were a transparent record of our labor, our sacrifices, and our small indulgences. Or so I had believed. This money was a shadow economy, a secret hoard harvested from the margins of our life. It represented hours of overtime he hadn't mentioned, bonuses he had hidden, or perhaps something far more sinister. It was a physical manifestation of a life I wasn't part of. The poison in my veins surged, turning into a searing, acidic heat. Is he paying for her? The thought was a jagged shard of glass cutting through my consciousness. I pictured the girl from the office again, her youthful glow, her easy laughter. Was he buying that laughter? Was he paying for the privilege of her time, her attention, her youth? Or was this something even more final? Was he building a life away from me, one brick of stolen cash at a time? Was this his escape fund, the price of a freedom that involved leaving me behind in the ruins of a decade-long lie? I watched as he carefully counted a few bills, his face etched with a focused, almost reverent concentration. He then slid the envelope back into its hiding place and stood up, brushing the dust from his knees with a casualness that made me want to howl with rage. He checked his reflection in the hallway mirror, the same mirror where he had smiled at me just yesterday, and adjusted his collar. He looked satisfied. He looked like a man who had everything under control. I retreated back into the bedroom before he could turn around, collapsing against the closed door, my hands trembling so violently I had to tuck them under my arms. The betrayal felt multifaceted now. It wasn't just the potential of another woman. It was the systematic, calculated deception of our financial and emotional partnership. Every time we had discussed our future, every time we had budgeted for a new appliance or worried about a rising bill, he had been sitting on a secret. He had let me believe we were a team, while he was playing a solo game with stakes I couldn't even imagine. The house suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in on me. The air was thick with the scent of the man I had loved for 10 years, but that scent now felt like a suffocating shroud. I realized that I no longer knew the man downstairs. I knew the version of him he allowed me to see, the husband mask he wore with practiced ease. But the man who measured his wife's neck in the dark, the man who held the hands of young girls in the sunlight, and the man who had envelopes of cash under the furniture, that man was a ghost, a monster born from the ashes of my trust. I heard the front door open and close. The engine of his car turned over, a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and up into the soles of my feet. He was gone, heading out into the world with his pockets lined with secrets and his heart, presumably, anchored somewhere else entirely. I stayed on the floor for a long time, the cold of the wood seeping into my bones. The suspicion was no longer just a feeling, it was a mandate. I couldn't sit in this hollow shell of a home any longer, waiting for him to come back and feed me more scraps of his manufactured affection. I needed to see where that money was going. I needed to see who it was being handed to. I needed to witness the final transaction of our marriage, even if it meant watching my own soul burn to the ground. I stood up, my movements no longer frantic, but possessed by a cold, sharp clarity. I walked to the window and watched the taillights of his car disappear around the corner. The woman who had made beef stew yesterday was dead. The woman who believed in sanctuaries had been evicted. All that was left was Patricia, the woman who would follow the money, follow the lies, and finally see the face of the person who had stolen her life. I began to dress, not with the care of a wife, but with the grim determination of a witness to a crime. Today, the shadows would no longer be my hiding place. They would be my path. There is a specific kind of madness that takes hold when you realize your life is a house of cards leaning into a gale. It is a cold, clinical insanity that doesn't scream or thrash, but instead moves with a terrifying, quiet precision. As I sat in my car, parked a discreet distance from the end of our driveway, I didn't feel like Patricia, the wife of 10 years. I felt like a ghost, a hollowed-out observer of a world that had already moved on without me. I watched David's car pull away, and without a second thought, I shifted into gear. I followed him, not because I wanted to find a reason to stay, but because I needed to see the final, jagged edge of the truth, even if it was the very thing that finally killed me. Driving through the familiar streets of our town felt like navigating a foreign city. The landmarks I had always associated with safety, the bakery where we bought our Sunday morning croissants, the park where we'd walked our first dog, the library where we'd spent hours side by side in silence, now looked like theatrical backdrops, flimsy and false. I stayed several cars behind him, my knuckles white against the steering wheel, my breath hitching every time he signaled a turn. My heart was a frantic, trapped bird, beating its wings against the cage of my ribs until I felt bruised from the inside out. I was a hunter of my own heartbreak, tracking the man who had been my sanctuary into the lair of his betrayal. He didn't head back to the office. Instead, he drove toward a part of the city characterized by boutique shops, cobblestone paths, and an air of effortless leisure. It was a place for people with time to kill and hearts that were light. He parked his car near a small, ivy-covered cafe, and I pulled into a spot half a block away, my engine idling like a low, growling threat. I watched through the windshield, my vision narrowing until the rest of the world blurred into a smear of gray and brown. And then there she was. She seemed to materialize out of the very sunlight, a creature of effervescent youth and vibrant color. She was wearing a light coat that swayed as she walked, her chestnut hair catching the afternoon light like spun silk. She was radiant. She was everything I feared I was no longer, untouched by the weary weight of shared years, unburdened by the gravity of a long-term commitment. I saw David step toward her, and the way his face transformed was a visceral blow to my soul. The weariness that usually hung about his shoulders dropped away. He looked younger, lighter, as if he were breathing a different, more oxygenated air than the stale atmosphere of our home. They met on the sidewalk, a few yards from the cafe entrance. There was no hesitation, no awkwardness of a new acquaintance. There was only the easy, terrifying fluidity of people who belonged to one another. I watched, my throat tight with a scream I couldn't release, as they began to walk. And then it happened. It was a small gesture, a mundane act that happens a million times a day on a million different streets, but to me, it was the sound of my universe finally fracturing. David reached out and took her hand. He didn't just brush against her. He sought her fingers out, lacing his own through hers with a practiced, intimate ease. It looked so natural, so sickeningly right. I watched them walk down the sidewalk, their strides synchronized, their bodies leaning toward each other as if drawn by a magnetic force. The man I thought I knew, the man whose hands were calloused from building our life, the man who used those same hands to hold me through my father's funeral, was now using that strength to anchor himself to a girl who was barely more than a stranger to me. Broad daylight is a cruel thing. It offers no shadows to hide the truth, no dim corners where you can pretend you might be mistaken. In the harsh, unforgiving glare of the afternoon sun, I saw the truth of my marriage. It wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It wasn't a temporary distraction. It was a complete and total replacement. They looked like a couple in the first, golden blush of love, the kind of love that believes it is invincible. They looked like us, 10 years ago. The sight of their joined hands felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making every breath a battle. My heart didn't just break. It shattered into 1,000 jagged, microscopic pieces that sliced through my insides with every pulse of blood. I thought of the envelope of cash under the sofa. I thought of the measuring tape around my neck. It all made a hideous, perfect sense now. He was investing in this new world, measuring the old one only to see how much of it he could still tolerate before he made his final exit. The betrayal was so quiet, so public, and so utterly devastating. I felt a profound sense of displacement, as if I had been erased from the narrative of my own life. I was the wife, the domestic fixture, the background noise to his real symphony. I watched them stop in front of a window, David pointing at something inside, his head thrown back in a laugh that I hadn't heard in months. The girl looked up at him with such adoration that I had to close my eyes, the image searing itself into my eyelids like a burn. I realized then that the man on the sidewalk was a stranger. The David I loved, the one who was my anchor and my sanctuary, didn't exist anymore. Perhaps he never did. Perhaps he was a character I had helped him create, a role he played until he finally grew tired of the script. This man, this stranger in broad daylight, was someone I didn't recognize. He was a man who could hold a secret in one hand and his mistress in the other, all while returning home to whistle a tune in a house he was systematically dismantling. I couldn't watch anymore. The air in the car had become toxic, thick with the scent of my own humiliation. I gripped the steering wheel until my fingers went numb, a strange, hysterical giggle bubbling up in my throat. I had wanted the truth. I had followed it like a star in the night, and it had led me straight into a sun that was burning me alive. There was no more room for doubt, no more space for the maybe that had kept me upright for the last 24 hours. I shifted the car into reverse, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. I needed to get away from the sidewalk, away from the sunlight, away from the sight of those interlaced fingers. As I pulled away from the curb, I saw them one last time through the rearview mirror. Two figures walking away from me, smaller and smaller, until they were nothing but shadows on the pavement. I was driving back to an empty house, but they were walking toward a future that didn't include me. The drive home was a blur of tears and white-knuckled terror. I wasn't just losing a husband, I was losing the very foundation of my identity. If David wasn't who I thought he was, then who was I? I was a woman who had been measured and found wanting. I was a woman whose 10 years of devotion could be discarded for a handful of secret cash and a younger hand to hold. By the time I reached our driveway, the cold clarity of the morning had turned into a hard, obsidian resolve. I couldn't stay. I wouldn't stay and be a ghost in a house that was already haunted by his lies. The shadows on the sidewalk had shown me the way out, and though my heart was in pieces, my feet finally knew where they had to go. Grief is not a single, sharp blow. It is a slow, relentless rising of the tide. By the time I turned the key in the lock of our front door, the water was already at my chin. I felt as though I were drowning in the very air of our home, each breath a struggle against the weight of the lies that now saturated the walls. The house was silent, yet it screamed with the echoes of everything I had discovered. I stood in the foyer, the same place where I had once waited with a full heart for the sound of David's car, and realized that I was standing in a tomb. Everything I saw, the antique mirror, the hand-woven rug, the photographs lining the hallway, was a relic of a woman who no longer existed. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, my footsteps heavy and uncoordinated. I was blinded by a sorrow so thick it felt like a physical veil drawn across my eyes. I couldn't look at the sofa without seeing David's hand reaching for that secret envelope of cash. I couldn't look at the dining table without remembering that I who had sat there in the dark, wondering why the world had gone cold. Every corner of this house had been built on a foundation of trust that had turned to sand, and I could feel the entire structure beginning to groan and collapse around me. I could not stay. To spend one more night under this roof would be to agree to my own disappearance. I reached our bedroom, the most sacred of our shared spaces, and felt a wave of nausea. This was the room of the measuring tape. This was the room of whispered promises and shared dreams. Now it was just a gallery of betrayals. With hands that shook so violently I had to grip the edge of the dresser to remain upright, I pulled a small, battered suitcase from the back of the closet. It was the one I used for solo trips back to see my sister, a relic of my life before David became my entire world. It felt appropriate that I would leave with the same vessel I used when I was just myself. Packing was a ritual of subtraction. I realized, as I stared at my overflowing closet, that so much of what I owned was a gift from him. Dresses he had admired, jewelry he had bought for anniversaries, coats he had insisted I needed for the winter. I looked at the silk blouse he'd given me last Christmas and felt a surge of revulsion. I didn't want the expensive things. I didn't want the tokens of his guilt or the carefully curated image of the well-kept wife. Those items were anchors designed to keep me moored to a sinking ship. I pushed them aside, my movements frantic and desperate. Instead, I searched for the pieces of my life that hadn't been tainted by his shadow. I packed a worn, oversized sweater that had belonged to my father. I took a collection of poetry I had bought for myself during a lonely summer in college. I took the small, ceramic bird my niece had made for me, its painted wings chipped, but its spirit still honest. These were the untouched memories, the fragments of a Patricia who existed independently of the man who was currently holding someone else's hand in the sunlight. I folded them with a reverence usually reserved for the dead, smoothing the fabric as if I were healing my own skin. Every item I placed in the suitcase felt like a brick being removed from a wall. As the bag grew heavier, I felt a strange, hollow lightness beginning to spread through my chest. I was unmaking a decade in 15 minutes. I didn't take the silver-backed hairbrush he had bought me or the perfume that he said reminded him of our honeymoon. I left the designer bags and the leather boots. I wanted nothing that was bought with the currency of his deception. I wanted to leave this house as clean as a bone, stripped of everything that made me his. I moved to the nightstand, my heart performing a slow, agonizing thud against my ribs. There, sitting in a small crystal dish, was my wedding ring. I picked it up, the gold cool and indifferent in my palm. I looked at the inscription inside, "Always yours," and a jagged, hysterical laugh caught in my throat. The words were a mockery, a cruel joke written in a language that had lost all meaning. For 10 years, this circle of metal had been the physical boundary of my world. It had been my shield, my identity, my pride. Now it was just a cold, silver goodbye. I didn't throw it. I didn't flush it down the drain or hurl it out the window in a fit of cinematic rage. My grief was too profound for such noise. Instead, I placed it carefully on the center of the nightstand, right where he would see it the moment he walked into the room. It sat there, a solitary, gleaming witness to the end of an era. It was the final period at the end of a long, beautiful sentence that had been revealed as a lie. By leaving it behind, I was giving him back his promise. He was no longer bound to me, and I was no longer anchored to him. I zipped the suitcase shut, the sound of the metal teeth biting together echoing like a finality through the quiet room. I stood there for a moment, looking at the bed we had shared, the pillows still indented from the morning. I thought of the woman who had woken up in this bed just a few hours ago, the woman who believed in sanctuaries. I felt a deep, piercing pity for her. She had been so brave in her ignorance, so certain of her footing while the ground was already gone. I walked out of the bedroom and down the stairs, the suitcase bumping rhythmically against my leg. Each step felt like a mile. In the kitchen, I saw the empty space where the thermal bag had been yesterday. I saw the chair where I had sat in the dark. I didn't stop to look around. I knew that if I lingered, the ghosts of our happy moments would try to pull me back into the water. I had to keep moving. I had to reach the shore. I reached the front door and paused, my hand on the cold brass knob. I took one last breath of the air that smelled of cedarwood and old parchment, the scent of the man I thought I knew. I let it out slowly, watching as the phantom of my marriage dissipated into the evening light. I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The air outside was crisp, smelling of damp earth and the coming winter. It was a harsh scent, but it was honest. I walked to my car, tossed the suitcase into the passenger seat, and didn't look back at the house. I knew that if I saw the curtains or the flower beds we had planted together, I might crumble. I shifted the car into gear and pulled away from the curb, leaving the mother story and the reality of life behind me in the rearview mirror. I was a woman with a small suitcase and a shattered heart, driving into a future that was a total, terrifying blank. But as I reached the end of the street, I realized that for the first time in 48 hours, I could finally breathe. The water was receding. I was no longer drowning. I was simply cold, and I was finally, devastatingly free. I can see him now, though I am miles away, separated by a highway of tears and a resolution as hard as flint. I can see him in my mind's eye as clearly as if I were a shadow lurking in the corner of our foyer. It is a haunting, a projection of my own grief onto the space we once shared. I imagine the sun has begun to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, casting long, skeletal shadows across the driveway. I imagine the sound of his car, that low, familiar rumble, pulling into the spot where my car used to be.
He doesn't know yet.
He is still living in the version of the world where I am waiting behind the door, perhaps still cold, perhaps still angry but present. He is still a man with a plan, a man with a secret he thinks will save us. I see him step out of the car. His movements are light, energized by the secret weight in his pocket. He is carrying a small, velvet-lined box, clutching it like a talisman. His eyes, I imagine, are bright with a boyish excitement, the kind of look he used to have when we were young, and every day was an unwritten poem. He thinks he is about to perform a miracle. He thinks that the gold inside that box will be the bridge that spans the chasm I opened between us. He is whistling again, that same, light-hearted tune that grated against my nerves yesterday, because in his mind, the story is about to have a happy ending. He is the hero returning with the prize, unaware that the kingdom he seeks to save has already been abandoned and burned to the ground. He turns the key in the lock, the metallic click echoing in the stillness of the porch. "Patricia?" he calls out as the door swings open. His voice is buoyant, full of an easy, unearned confidence. He expects a reply. He expects the sound of my footsteps, the scent of dinner, the familiar domestic friction of a Tuesday night. But what greets him is the silence of a tomb. It isn't just a lack of sound. It is a heavy, pressurized absence. It is the sound of a house that has stopped breathing. I see him pause in the foyer, his smile faltering just a fraction. The air in the house is cold. I had turned the thermostat down before I left, a final, subconscious act of preservation. He stands there, the small box in his hand, looking at the empty hallway. The light from the street lamp outside filters through the transom window, casting a pale, sickly glow over the rug. "Trish? Honey, I'm home," he tries again, but this time, there is a tremor of uncertainty in his tone. His voice doesn't travel. It hits the walls and drops, dead and hollow. He walks into the kitchen, the floorboards groaning under his weight like a chorus of accusations. He sees the clean counters, the cold stove, the lack of a meal. The silence here is even more profound. It is the silence of a laboratory after an experiment has failed. He sets the box down on the granite island for a moment, his hands beginning to tremble. He looks at the chair where I sat in the dark, and for the first time, a shadow of genuine fear crosses his face. He is beginning to realize that the atmosphere hasn't just changed, it has vanished. The sanctuary has been evacuated. Driven by a sudden, frantic impulse, he leaves the kitchen and heads for the stairs. He takes them two at a time, his breathing becoming ragged, the whistling long forgotten. "Patricia," he yells, his voice cracking, the name echoing through the house like a frantic bird trapped in a chimney. He bursts into our bedroom, the room where he measured my neck, the room where I packed my heart into a battered suitcase. He stops at the threshold. The room is dark, save for the silver moonlight that I left behind. The bed is made with a clinical, terrifying precision. The closet door is slightly ajar, revealing the empty hangers that once held my life. But his eyes are drawn to the nightstand. There, sitting in the center of the crystal dish, is my wedding ring. I can imagine him walking toward it, his legs feeling like they are made of water. He reaches out, his fingers, the calloused, honest hands of a stranger, brushing the cold metal. He picks it up, and in the moonlight, the inscription, "Always yours," must look like a death warrant. The ring is a goodbye that requires no translation. It is the physical manifestation of a contract that has been voided. He collapses onto the edge of the bed, the small velvet box still clutched in his other hand. He opens it slowly. The hinge let out a tiny, pathetic creak. Inside, the gold necklace, the one he spent months designing, the one he hid the money for, the one he measured me for in the dark, gleams with a cruel, useless beauty. It was meant to be a circle of grace, a symbol of his hidden devotion. Instead, it is a relic of a misunderstanding that has cost him everything. The realization dawning on him must be a physical pain, a slow-motion car crash of the soul. He sees the girl from the office in his mind, but now he sees her through my eyes. He sees the hand-holding, the secret meetings, the hidden cash, and he realizes how it all looked. He realizes that while he was building a surprise, he was simultaneously building a gallows. He had been so focused on the gift that he forgot to tend to the woman it was intended for. He had been so sure of his own narrative that he failed to see I was living in a tragedy. He puts his head in his hands, the ring in one palm and the necklace in the other. The silence of the house closes in on him, a suffocating weight that no amount of gold can lift. He calls my name one last time, a broken, whispered plea that goes unanswered. Patricia, please. But I am gone. I am a ghost that has finally left the building, taking with me the only thing that made these walls a home. In this imagined scene, I don't feel triumph. I don't feel the cold satisfaction of revenge. I only feel a profound, echoing sadness. We are both sitting in the dark now, miles apart, holding the jagged pieces of a broken promise. He is in a house that is no longer a sanctuary, and I am in a world that has no anchor. The silence of the tomb is ours to share, a final, devastating common ground. I don't know how long I had been sitting there. Time had ceased to be a linear progression of minutes and hours. It had become a stagnant pool of gray, a vast and featureless expanse where I was the only fixed point. The park was a kaleidoscope of lives in motion, mothers chasing toddlers through the fallen leaves, joggers with their rhythmic, mechanical breathing, elderly couples walking hand in hand with a serenity that made my chest ache, but I was a ghost in their midst. I sat on a weather-beaten wooden bench, my small suitcase tucked against my ankles like a loyal, battered dog. I was staring at a patch of gravel, watching the way the pebbles caught the dying light, focusing on their jagged edges, because looking at the horizon felt too much like looking at a future that had been erased. The air was turning sharp as evening settled in, the kind of cold that doesn't just nip at your skin but settles into your marrow. I didn't feel it. I was insulated by a layer of emotional numbness so thick that the physical world felt distant, a flickering projection on a screen I was no longer watching. I felt unmoored, a ship that had finally snapped its anchor and was now drifting into a cavernous, dark sea. I was no longer a wife. I was no longer a partner. I was just Patricia, a woman sitting on a bench with the wreckage of 10 years packed into a polyester bag. The silence of the park was filled with the ghosts of my own memories, whispering accusations of how I could have been so blind, how I could have mistaken a crumbling cliff for a sanctuary. A shadow fell over me, stretching long and thin across the gravel. It was a sudden, jarring intrusion into my isolation. My first thought was that a stranger was looking for directions, or perhaps a gardener coming to tell me the park was closing. I didn't want to look up. I didn't want to engage with a world that was still turning when mine had ground to such a violent halt. But the shadow remained, patient and unmoving, a dark blemish on my private grief. I slowly lifted my head, my neck stiff, my eyes stinging from the hours of unshed tears. I expected to see a face I didn't know, a face that would look at me with the fleeting, polite concern of a passerby. But it was her. The air vanished from my lungs in a single, agonizing gasp. My heart, which had been a dull, thudding weight, suddenly exploded into a frantic, panicked rhythm. It was the girl, the one from the office, the one with the chestnut hair and the youthful glow, the one who had held David's hand in the broad daylight while I watched from the shadows of my own despair. She was standing only a few feet away, her silhouette framed by the golden hour, looking like an angel of my own destruction. My first instinct was a visceral, animalistic urge to flee. I wanted to grab my suitcase and run until my legs gave out, to put as much distance as possible between myself and the living embodiment of my failure. I wanted to scream at her, to ask her how she could take a man's life and dismantle it with such effortless grace. I wanted to hate her with a fire that would burn the park to ash. I tightened my grip on the handle of my bag, my knuckles turning white, my body tensing for flight. But something in her expression stopped me. It wasn't the look I had expected. There was no triumph in her eyes, no smug satisfaction of the other woman who had won a prize she didn't deserve. There was no mockery, no cruelty. Instead, her face was a map of profound, unsettling kindness. Her brow was furrowed with a genuine concern that felt like a slap to my face. She looked at me not as a rival, but as someone who was witnessing a tragedy in real time. "You're David's wife, aren't you?" she asked. Her voice was just as I had imagined, soft, melodic, and terrifyingly clear. It was the voice of the woman who had laughed with my husband while I was making stew. I couldn't speak. My throat felt like it was filled with broken glass. I only stared at her, my breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. The audacity of her question, the sheer, breathtaking intimacy of her recognizing me, made the world tilt on its axis. How did she know who I was? Had he shown her pictures? Had they laughed about the pale, tired wife over expensive coffee? "I saw you," she continued, stepping closer, her movements cautious, as if she were approaching a wounded animal. "Yesterday. At the office. You were outside the glass door for a second, weren't you? You looked the same way you look now." She sat down on the far end of the bench, leaving a respectful distance between us, but the air between us was electric with unspoken truths. I pulled my coat tighter, a pathetic attempt to shield myself from her gaze. "Why do you look so utterly broken?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper that was almost a plea. "I've seen David talk about you. I've seen the way he looks when he mentions your name. It's like he's describing the very air he breathes. But you look like you've lost everything." I felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up in my chest, a jagged, ugly sound that I barely managed to suppress. How dare she? I thought. How dare she speak of his devotion while she is the one holding his hand? The irony was a poison, a cruel joke that I was the only one not in on. "I saw you," I finally managed to whisper, my voice sounding like it belonged to a different woman, someone much older and much more tired. "I saw you at the office. I saw you on the sidewalk today. I saw you holding his hand. I saw the money under the sofa." The girl's eyes widened, a flash of realization crossing her features. For a moment, she didn't say anything, the only sound the distant call of a bird and the rustle of leaves. She looked down at her own hands, then back at me, a soft, sad smile playing on her lips. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh no. Is that what you think?" She didn't look guilty. She looked heartbroken. Not for herself, but for me. The kindness in her expression deepened, turning into a look of such immense empathy that it began to erode the wall of ice I had built around my heart. In that moment, sitting on a lonely bench in the fading light, I realized that the stranger I had been following wasn't the villain of my story. She was something else entirely. She was a mirror, reflecting a truth I had been too blinded by pain to see. "You have it all wrong," she said, her voice steady and full of a strange, quiet authority. "You have it so incredibly wrong, Patricia. Please just listen to me for a moment. Please don't run." I stayed. Not because I trusted her, but because the exhaustion of the last 48 hours had finally caught up to me. I had no more strength to run. I was a woman who had reached the end of her rope, and if this girl was the one to tell me the final, devastating truth, then so be it. I sat there, a ghost on a bench, waiting for the words that would either finish the job of destroying me or, somehow, pull me back from the edge of the abyss. The shadow had fallen, but for the first time, I didn't want to hide from it. I wanted to see what was hidden in the dark. The silence that followed her request was unlike the heavy, suffocating silence of my empty house. This was a fragile, expectant hush, like the moment before a conductor raises his baton. I sat perfectly still, my hands still gripping the cold leather of my suitcase handle, watching her. In the twilight, her face seemed to lose its sharp, youthful edge and take on a quality of timeless grace. She didn't look like a girl who was stealing a husband. She looked like a girl who was carrying a heavy, beautiful secret. When she finally spoke, her voice was like soft velvet, a gentle caress that began to unravel the tight, jagged knots of my heart. "My name is Maya," she began, her eyes never leaving mine. "And I think you need to know that for the last 4 months, your husband has been the most difficult, meticulous, and stubbornly devoted client I have ever had the pleasure of serving." I blinked, the words sliding over me without immediately sinking in. "Client?" I whispered, the word feeling foreign and nonsensical. Maya nodded, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "I am a jeweler's apprentice at the studio 3 blocks from David's office. I specialize in custom gold work, one-of-a-kind pieces that take months of labor and an incredible amount of patience. David came to me in late autumn. He told me he wanted to create something for his wife that didn't exist in any store. He wanted something that matched her soul, he said. Those were his exact words, Patricia." I felt a sharp, sudden pang in my chest, a needle prick of light through the darkness of my grief. I thought of the office, the secret meetings, the leaning in, the laughter. "The times you saw us at the office," Maya continued, sensing the direction of my thoughts, "those weren't trysts. He was too busy to come to the studio during normal hours, so I would bring sketches and wax molds to him. He was obsessed with every detail. He spent hours debating the weight of the chain, the purity of the gold, the way the clasp would feel against your skin. He didn't want a piece of jewelry. He wanted a physical manifestation of 10 years of devotion. He was so terrified of you finding out, of ruining the surprise, that he would barely even speak my name in public." The image of them together, through the glass partition, shifted. I saw it now, not as the intimacy of lovers, but as the intense collaboration of a man trying to build a masterpiece for the woman he loved. The leaning in wasn't a prelude to a kiss. It was a man squinting at a tiny sketch of a gold link. The laughter wasn't a shared flirtation. It was the relief of finally getting a detail right. "And today?" I asked, my voice trembling, a desperate hope beginning to fight with the remnants of my bitterness. "On the sidewalk. I saw you. You were holding his hand." Maya reached into her bag and pulled out a small, silk-lined pouch, holding it with a reverence that made my breath catch. "Today was the final delivery. The piece is incredibly delicate, and the gold is soft. I was terrified of dropping it or having it snagged in the crowd." When we left the studio to walk to his car, the street was packed with tourists and commuters. David saw how nervous I was. He took my hand, not because he wanted to hold it, but to anchor me, to guide me through the crowd like a shield so that nothing would happen to the gift he had spent a year dreaming about. It wasn't an act of romance, Patricia. It was an act of protection. For you. The world began to tilt, but this time, it was tilting back toward the light. I felt a wave of nausea, followed by a cold, drenching realization. This stranger on the sidewalk wasn't David. The stranger was me, the woman who had watched from the shadows and assumed the worst of a man who had never given her a reason to doubt. "But the money," I stammered, the last pillar of my suspicion beginning to crumble. "I found an envelope. Thousands of dollars hidden under the sofa. Why hide it if it was just a gift?" Maya's expression softened even further, a look of profound pity in her eyes. "Because he didn't want it to come from your joint savings. He told me he didn't want you to feel the cost of it. He wanted it to be a pure sacrifice. For the last year, Patricia, David has been working 4 hours of overtime every single night. He's been skipping lunches, eating crackers at his desk, and stashing away every extra cent he earned. He didn't want you to see the struggle. He only wanted you to see the gold. That money under the sofa? That wasn't an escape fund. That was a year's worth of skipped meals and exhaustion, all saved in secret so he could give you something that proved you were worth everything to him. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the solar plexus, knocking the air from my lungs. I slumped back against the bench, the suitcase at my feet feeling like an anchor of my own making, dragging me down into a sea of shame. I had built a gallows for a saint. I had looked at a year of sacrifice and seen a betrayal. I had looked at his tired eyes and seen a wandering heart. I thought of the measuring tape, the bizarre, frightening moment in the bedroom. I saw it now through his eyes. A man in the dark, trying to measure the neck of the woman he loved so the gift would fit perfectly, his heart full of a secret joy, only to be met with the ice and venom of a wife who had already decided he was a monster. He loves you with a ferocity that I have never seen in another human being, Maya whispered. He told me once that you were his anchor. He said that without you, the world was just noise. He was so excited today, Patricia. He was finally going to show you. He was finally going to bring the surprise home. I looked down at my hands, the hands that had packed a suitcase, the hands that had stripped a wedding ring from my finger and left it on a cold nightstand like a discarded scrap of trash. I felt a sob rise in my throat, a jagged, agonizing sound that tore through the quiet of the park. I wasn't the victim of a tragedy. I was the author of one. While he was building a sanctuary of gold, I was burning down the house we lived in. I have to go, I choked out, stumbling to my feet. The suitcase fell over, spilling a few of my untouched memories onto the gravel, but I didn't care. I didn't need the ceramic bird or the old sweater. I needed the man I had abandoned. Patricia, wait. Maya called out, but I was already running. I ran past the joggers, past the mothers, past the shadows of the trees that now seemed to reach out to me in warning. My lungs burned with every breath, the cold air stinging my throat, but I didn't slow down. I had to reach him. I had to get back to the house that I had turned into a tomb. I had to find the man who had measured my neck in the dark and tell him that I was sorry, that I was so sorry for forgetting that he was the only sanctuary I ever truly had. The truth was finally unveiled, but it was a heavy, shimmering thing, and as I ran toward the wreckage of my marriage, I prayed to a God I hadn't spoken to in years that the gold hadn't arrived too late. I had seen the shadows on the sidewalk, but I had been looking at the wrong side of the light. Now, all I could do was run toward the man who had spent a year skipping lunch to prove that I was his everything, hoping he was still standing in the dark, waiting for the woman who had lost her way. The world was a blurred smear of streetlights and skeletal trees as I ran. I didn't call for a taxi. I didn't wait for the logic of my mind to catch up with the frantic desperation of my heart. I simply ran. My lungs burned with every intake of the biting evening air, a searing, icy fire that felt like a necessary penance for the heat of my earlier rage. Each step against the pavement was a heartbeat, a thudding rhythmic confession. I was wrong. I was wrong. I was wrong. The suitcase, once a vessel for my liberation, was now a heavy, clattering anchor that I refused to drop, even as it bruised my legs. It was the physical evidence of my lack of faith, and I would carry it back to the house like a cross. The realization of what I had done didn't just hurt, it dismantled me. It hit me with the force of a physical blow, a concussive shock that left my spirit reeling. How could I have been so blind? I had lived with this man for a decade, had slept beside him, had built a sanctuary with him, yet I had allowed a few moments of misinterpreted silence to erase 1,000 days of proof. Jealousy hadn't just been a feeling, it had been a corrosive acid that I had willingly poured over the foundation of my life. I had looked at his exhaustion and seen a man bored of me, when in reality, he was a man exhausting himself for me. I had looked at the secret cache and seen a betrayal of our partnership, when it was actually the ultimate expression of it, a sacrifice so pure he didn't even want the credit for the cost. As I turned the corner onto our street, the familiar silhouette of our home came into view. In the deepening indigo of the twilight, the house looked smaller, more fragile. The windows were dark, save for the single light I had left on in the foyer, which now looked like a lonely eye watching the wreckage of a storm. My mind replayed the moment I had left, the ring on the nightstand, the silence I had weaponized, the goodbye I had delivered with such cold, hollow pride. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated terror. What if I was too late? What if the always yours I had discarded had finally been taken to heart? What if, in my haste to protect myself from a lie, I had destroyed the only truth that ever mattered? The drive up to the house felt like a mile-long gauntlet. I dropped the suitcase at the edge of the driveway, the sound of it hitting the gravel echoing like a gunshot in the quiet neighborhood. I didn't care about the clothes or the untouched memories anymore. They were worthless without the man who gave them context. I stumbled toward the porch, my legs shaking, my vision swimming with tears that were no longer about grief, but about a crushing, suffocating shame. I found him there. David wasn't inside the house. He was standing by the front door, half slumped against the frame, as if the wood were the only thing keeping him upright. In the pale, artificial glow of the porch light, he looked a decade older than the man I had followed that morning. The vibrant, excited man Maya had described was gone. In his place was a man whose soul had been hollowed out. His coat was still on, but it hung loosely on his shoulders, and his hair was disheveled as if he had been running his hands through it in a fever of confusion. But it was his face that broke me. It was etched with a terror I had never seen in all our years together, not even when we faced our worst hardships. It wasn't the terror of someone who is angry. It was the terror of a child who has been abandoned in the dark without a reason. He held the small velvet box in one hand, the lid open, the gold inside catching the light in a way that looked like a mocking, golden grin. In his other hand, he held my wedding ring. He was staring at it with an intensity so fierce it looked like he was trying to breathe life back into the cold metal. David, I choked out. The name was a ragged, broken thing, barely audible over the sound of my own sobbing. He flinched, his head snapping up as if I were a ghost he hadn't expected to see. For a long, agonizing moment, he didn't move. He just looked at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, searching my face for an explanation to the nightmare he had walked into. The silence between us was no longer the icy wall I had built. It was a vast, aching canyon of misunderstanding. "Patricia," he whispered. His voice was a thin thread of sound, vibrating with a fear that made my heart bleed. You came back." "I never should have left," I cried, collapsing onto the bottom step of the porch. I couldn't reach him yet. The weight of my guilt was too heavy to allow me to stand. "I saw her, David. I saw Maya. She told me everything. She told me about the jewelry, about the overtime, about the money, about why you held her hand." The terror in his eyes didn't vanish immediately. It was replaced by a slow, agonizing confusion. He looked down at the gold necklace in the box, then back at me. "I just wanted it to be perfect," he said, his voice cracking. "I wanted to give you something that wasn't just a thing. I wanted to give you something that was us. I thought if I kept it a secret, if I did it all on my own, it would mean more. I didn't realize. I didn't know you were watching the shadows. I thought I was building a surprise, Trish. I didn't know I was building a wall." "It wasn't you," I sobbed, burying my face in my hands. "It was me. I let my own fears tell me a story that wasn't true. I looked at the man who has loved me better than anyone in this world, and I decided he was a liar. I saw the gold, and I thought it was ash. Can you ever forgive me? Can you ever look at me without seeing the woman who left her ring on the table?" I looked up at him through the veil of my hair, expecting to see resentment, expecting to see the first sparks of a justified anger. But David was, as he had always been, my sanctuary. He didn't yell. He didn't point out the cruelty of my silence or the arrogance of my assumptions. Instead, he moved. He stepped off the porch, his movements slow and deliberate, and knelt on the cold concrete beside me. He didn't touch me at first. He just sat there, the two of us huddled together in the dark, the discarded suitcase a few yards away and the golden promise still shining in his hand. The weight of the silence changed then. It was no longer a tomb. It was a hospital room, a place of recovery. I felt the heat of him, the familiar cedarwood and old parchment scent, and I realized that I had almost traded this real, breathing, imperfect, magnificent man for a ghost of my own making. I was so scared, Trish, he whispered, his forehead leaning against mine. I walked in, and the house was cold. I saw the ring and I thought I had lost the only person who knew who I really was. I thought the 10 years meant nothing to you. It means everything, I gasped, reaching out to grasp his coat, pulling him closer until there was no space for lies to breathe between us. It is my everything. I am so sorry, David. I am so sorry. We sat there on the stairs for a long time, the cold of the night ignored, the gold necklace forgotten on the step beside us. The guilt was still there, a heavy stone in my stomach, but the terror was receding. I realized then that love isn't just about the moments of clarity and the beautiful surprises. It's about the way you navigate the shadows when the sun goes cold. I had failed the test of faith, but David, my steady, calloused, honest David, was giving me a second chance to learn the lesson. The silence was no longer the jagged, clinical thing it had been for the past 48 hours. It was thick and heavy, yes, but it was weighted with the gravity of unspoken apologies and the slow, rhythmic pulse of a heart that was trying to find its beat again. I looked at David, and in the amber glow of the porch light, I saw the man I had nearly lost. I saw the exhaustion etched into the corners of his eyes, the slight tremble in his hands, and the vast, unshakable kindness that had always been his defining feature. I felt a wave of shame so profound it threatened to pull me back into the dark, but then he reached out, and the world steadied. He didn't reproach me. He didn't ask for a list of my transgressions or demand an explanation for the suitcase lying abandoned in the gravel. He simply looked at me with a gaze that was both an invitation and a benediction. He reached for the small velvet box he had been clutching, his fingers moving with a slow, deliberate grace. When the lid clicked open, the light from the foyer spilled into the box, and I saw it, the reason for the secrets, the reason for the skipped meals, and the reason for the stranger I had seen on the sidewalk. It was a necklace of such exquisite, understated beauty that it took my breath away. It wasn't a showy piece of commercial jewelry. It was a delicate, intricate web of solid gold, the links so fine they looked like a thread of sunlight captured in metal. At the center hung a pendant that seemed to shift and change as it caught the light, a series of overlapping circles that represented, I realized, the layers of a life built together. It was a masterpiece of devotion, a physical map of a man's silent labor. I took the measurement that night, David whispered, his voice steady now, though his eyes were still bright with the remnants of his earlier terror. In the dark, while you were so angry, I knew you thought I was being cruel. I knew you felt like I was comparing you to something you weren't. But I just needed to be sure it would sit perfectly. I wanted it to rest right here, he said, his thumb brushing the hollow of my throat, at the pulse of you. I wanted you to feel its weight every time you breathed, so you would know, even when I wasn't there, that you were held. I felt a sob break in my chest, a sound of pure, crystalline relief. I thought of Chapter 4, of how I had recoiled from the cold touch of the measuring tape, thinking it was a noose, a mockery, a clinical assessment of my fading youth. I had felt like a piece of lumber being sized for a coffin. But in reality, David had been treating me like a cathedral. He had been measuring the most sacred part of his world to ensure that his offering was worthy. My jealousy had turned a gesture of supreme intimacy into a weapon of betrayal. I had seen a monster in the dark, but the only monster had been my own lack of faith. Put it on me, I whispered, my voice thick with tears. David took the necklace from the box, the gold cascading through his fingers like water. He stepped behind me, his presence a warm, solid wall against my back. I felt his hands, those calloused, honest hands that I had doubted, move toward the nape of my neck. As he brought the gold around, the cold metal touched my skin for a fleeting second, sending a shiver through my body. But as he worked the clasp, his fingers brushing against my hair, the metal began to change. It absorbed the heat of his skin and the rising warmth of mine, until it no longer felt like a foreign object. It felt like a part of me. When the clasp clicked into place, it felt like the final lock on a door that had been swinging wildly in a storm. The necklace sat perfectly against my skin, a gentle, golden weight that anchored me to the present moment. I turned around to face him, my hands moving up to touch the pendant. It was warm, warm with the heat of his sacrifice, warm with the hours of overtime, and warm with the love that had survived my own attempts to destroy it. "It's beautiful, David," I said, the words feeling inadequate for the weight of what the gift represented. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "It's you, Trish," he replied, his hands coming up to cup my face. "It's all the years. It's the way you've stayed. It's the way you're the only thing that makes sense to me." We stood there in the doorway for a long time, the shadows of the night lengthening around us, but for the first time in days, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I realized then that I had been looking for love in the wrong places. I had been looking for it in the grand gestures, in the absence of conflict, and in the superficial glow of youth. I had been looking for what I could see. But love, true, enduring love, isn't just about what is visible in the sunlight. It's about the faith we keep when the world goes dark. It's about the man who skips his lunch for a year to buy his wife a secret gift. It's about the woman who realizes she was wrong and runs back through the cold to find her way home. The suitcase was still in the driveway, a reminder of the woman I almost became, the woman who would have traded a decade of truth for a moment of misunderstood shadow. But as David pulled me into his arms, burying his face in my hair, that woman vanished. She was replaced by Patricia, a woman who finally understood that a sanctuary isn't a building that never cracks. It's the person who stays and helps you mend the fissures when the earth shakes. We walked into the house together, and as David flicked the light on in the kitchen, the room was flooded with a warmth that had nothing to do with the thermostat. The scent of cedarwood and old parchment was no longer a ghost. It was the air I breathed. I looked at the dining table, and I didn't see the shadows of my suspicion. I saw the place where we would eat our dinner tomorrow, and the day after that, and for all the days that remained. My wedding ring was still on the nightstand, but it wouldn't stay there for long. I would slide it back onto my finger, and this time, it would mean more than it ever had before. It wouldn't just be a symbol of a contract. It would be a symbol of a resurrection. We were whole again. Not because we were perfect, and not because the pain of the last 48 hours had disappeared, but because we had chosen to look past the shadows and see the light that was still burning in the center of us. The gold necklace rested against my collarbone, a constant, rhythmic reminder of the pulse of our marriage. It was a circle of grace, a promise kept in the dark, and a testament to the man who never stopped measuring the depth of his devotion. As the door clicked shut behind us, leaving the cold and the lies and the suitcase on the other side, I realized that I didn't need a sanctuary of stone and mortar. I had David. And in the quiet, steady rhythm of our shared life, I finally knew that I was home. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying with Patricia's journey until the very end. The time you've spent watching this story is a true honor for me. If any part of this tale touched your heart or sparked a memory, I would be so grateful if you shared your thoughts in the comments. And if you find meaning in the stories here on Queen's Revenge, your support through subscribing means the world to me as I continue to create from the heart.